Have you ever heard someone say, I usually can't tolerate wheat, but I felt totally fine eating the bread in Germany or the pasta in Italy? Maybe you've even said that yourself. Well, in this episode, we're exploring whether there really is something special about European wheat and what we might be able to borrow from our European neighbors to improve our experience of wheat products here at home. Hello, and welcome to the Nutrition Diva podcast, a show where we take a closer look at nutrition memes and trends so that you can make more informed choices about what you eat. I'm your host, Monica Reinagel, and today I want to talk about the widespread perception that wheat products in Europe or elsewhere are somehow healthier or less likely to trigger sensitivities than wheat products here in the United States. And I bet at some point you've heard someone say, American wheat makes me sick, but when I eat the pasta in Italy or the baguettes in France, I feel totally fine. And maybe you've even experienced this yourself. So let's take a closer look at what might be going on here. First, probably useful to get a sense of how common wheat-related sensitivities actually are. True celiac disease, this is an autoimmune disorder triggered by gluten, is relatively rare. It affects roughly 1% of the population in both the US and Europe. However, non-celiac gluten sensitivity or wheat sensitivity, where people who do not have celiac disease nonetheless report symptoms that seem to be triggered by wheat, that's a lot more common. Surveys show that about 10 to 15% of US adults report non-celiac gluten or wheat sensitivity, whereas only about 5 to 10% of Europeans do. However, when researchers conduct controlled clinical trials where participants don't know whether they're actually consuming gluten or a placebo, the prevalence of true gluten sensitivity drops dramatically to somewhere between 1 and 3%. So, what this suggests is that many people who believe that they are sensitive to gluten might actually be reacting to something else in wheat, such as certain starches or fermentable carbohydrates. Either way, however, our conversation today is focused specifically on non-celiac sensitivities. Because for people with diagnosed celiac disease, consuming gluten from any source, American, European, anywhere at all, is harmful and should always be avoided. There are a lot of potential explanations for why American wheat might affect people differently. Let's take a look at them one by one. One common belief is that American wheat might be fundamentally different from European wheat at the genetic level, perhaps containing more gluten or other problematic proteins. There is some truth to this, only because most American wheat is hard red wheat. This is a variety known for its higher gluten content compared to the soft wheat varieties that are more commonly grown in Europe. That higher gluten content helps make bread fluffier and chewier, but it could theoretically trigger more digestive symptoms in sensitive individuals. However, commercial bakeries in both regions often blend different wheat types together. They may even add extra gluten, known as vital wheat gluten, specifically to improve the dough texture and the rise. As a result, gluten content in commercial bread products might really be similar across regions despite differences in the wheat varieties. But gluten isn't the only protein in wheat that could potentially cause issues. Researchers are now looking closely at another group of proteins called amylase trypsin inhibitors, or ATIs. Unlike gluten, ATIs don't cause celiac disease, but they can trigger inflammation or digestive symptoms in sensitive people. Modern high-yield wheat varieties often contain higher ATI levels than older heritage grains or ancient grains such as einkorn or emmer wheat. That said, most of the commercial bread in both the US and Europe is produced using the more modern varieties. However, there is one other factor that we might want to consider here, and that is that Europeans do traditionally consume more whole grain and rye breads, which tend to be lower in gluten compared to white bread. While any or all of these differences could be a factor, I think they are unlikely to be the entire story. But another frequently proposed explanation is that differences in food processing might influence how easily it's digested. For example, certain additives that are sometimes used in the US to enhance bread texture and extend its shelf life, such as potassium bromate and azodicarbonamide, are banned in Europe. However, despite consumer suspicions, current scientific evidence does not strongly link these specific additives to digestive symptoms. While it's theoretically possible that a small number of people could react to them, I think it's unlikely that they're a primary driver behind widespread wheat sensitivity. Another potential factor involves the methods used to leaven the bread. While commercial bread production in the United States frequently relies on rapid rise yeast, traditional European baking techniques are more likely to employ slower fermentation, such as a sourdough starter. These slower methods significantly reduce the levels of fermentable carbohydrates, which can contribute to things like bloating or gas or other digestive discomforts, particularly in sensitive individuals. And clinical research confirms that people who report digestive discomfort after eating bread often do better when they try traditionally fermented sourdough breads, and that's pretty much regardless of the actual gluten content. So while chemical additives might not be a major factor, bread making methods, specifically that slow fermentation, might indeed help explain why many people report feeling better after eating bread in Europe. Another popular theory points to the herbicide glyphosate, commonly known by the brand name Roundup, which is sometimes sprayed on wheat crops before they're harvested to help them dry out more quickly. This practice is more common in North America, whereas it is much less frequent and more strictly regulated in Europe. And understandably, this has raised concerns among many people who wonder if glyphosate residues might contribute to digestive or inflammatory symptoms. Studies that have investigated dietary exposure to glyphosate, as opposed to industrial exposure, suggest that the residues present in food are, in general, extremely low, far below the levels that have shown effects in animal or cell studies. And additionally, there hasn't been convincing research to date directly linking dietary glyphosate exposure from typical wheat consumption to digestive symptoms or microbiome disruption in humans. While concerns about pesticides are certainly valid from environmental and regulatory perspectives, glyphosate residues in wheat appear to be an unlikely explanation for why people might experience fewer symptoms when they're eating bread in Europe compared to the US. Upon closer examination, it doesn't look like anything specific about American wheat varieties or processing methods really fully explains this phenomenon. But there still are some other factors that could offer more insight here. One frequently overlooked aspect is the context in which Americans are consuming European wheat, typically while they're on vacation. Simply put, many of those Americans who are enjoying the baguettes in Paris or pasta in Rome are likely to be less stressed than when they're quickly grabbing a sandwich during a busy workday back home. And when we are more relaxed, our digestive symptoms function better. Europeans also tend to enjoy and promote more leisurely eating with extended social time at the table and lower stress environments. So it might be less about what's different in the bread and more about what's different about the environment. Portion sizes also tend to be considerably smaller across the board in Europe, and this might also play a role. When it comes to wheat sensitivity and digestive comfort, the quantity of wheat consumed at a single sitting might actually matter more than the quality or the specific characteristics of the wheat itself. So eating larger portions is obviously going to mean taking in more gluten or more fermentable carbohydrates and potentially more ATIs, all of which could collectively push someone past the threshold where symptoms occur. European meals, on the other hand, generally feature smaller servings of bread, pasta, and pastries compared to typical American servings. An Italian restaurant, for instance, usually serves pastas in portions roughly half the size of what you would find in a typical American establishment. And similarly, bakery products and sandwiches in Europe tend to be smaller. Simply consuming fewer wheat-based foods at one time, regardless of the wheat's origin, could significantly reduce digestive symptoms. So, while it's tempting to focus on what's wrong with American wheat, maybe we also need to consider what's right about European portions and eating styles. Now, as I said, none of this matters for those people who do have celiac disease or a true wheat allergy. If that's you, it doesn't matter whether the wheat was grown in Kansas or on Mars, or whether you're eating it at your desk or at a Riviera resort. Those with celiac and wheat allergy need to strictly avoid wheat no matter what. If that's not your situation, but you still feel that wheat products cause some issues for you, you could always see whether borrowing some best practices from our European neighbors could make a difference. And so here are a couple of tips. Number 1, choose sourdough or traditionally fermented breads, preferably made with whole grains. Number 2, eat smaller portions of wheat-based products and potentially everything else. And number 3, slow down, eat more mindfully. Make mealtimes a time to relax and be with people you care about. And finally, if certain foods clearly make you feel better or worse, I don't think you need a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial to justify your decision to modify your food choices. However, before we jump to any conclusions or explanations for what's going on and what explains this, I think it is still important to think critically about the science and the evidence. And that's what I've tried to do today. If you have a question about food or nutrition that you'd like me to address in a future episode, you can send it to me. Just send me an email to nutrition@quickanddirtytips.com. And if you'd like to find out about having me present to your organization or speak at your next event, you can learn more at wellnessworkshere.com. Nutrition Diva is a Quick and Dirty Tips podcast. Steve Riekeberg is my audio engineer. Brandon Getches provides script editing. Holly Hutchings is the digital operations specialist, and Morgan Christensen heads up our podcast operations and advertising. Davina Tomlin is in charge of marketing and publicity, and we also get indispensable support from Nat Hoops. Thanks to all of them, and thanks to you for listening.